Thanks everyone for coming tonight to the continuation of the 2015 Wilderness Issues Lecture Series. So tonight, I would like to introduce Bruce Smith, who's going to be talking with us about mountain goats. He's a veteran wildlife manager and scientist of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. He spent most of his 30-year federal career at the Wind River Indian Reservation and the National Elk Refuge in Wyoming. He's worked with most large mammal species in the western United States, and his research has produced over 40 publications on the biology and conservation of wildlife populations. He holds both bachelor's and master's degrees from the University of Montana and a PhD from the University of Wyoming. He's lived for much of 3 years among mountain goats in the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness area while studying their winter ecology when he was working on his master's degree through UM. Since retiring as a field biologist and moving with his wife Diana to Sheridan, Montana, which is a new geographic lesson for me, I thought it was a typo at first, but there's actually a magical place called Sheridan, Montana. There he's been writing and speaking throughout the West to promote conservation of wildlife and wildlands. He's published 4 books: Imperfect Pasture, the first book written about the National Elk Refuge; Wildlife on the Wind, about his work on the eastern Shoshone and northern Arapaho tribes to restore wildlife populations on the Wind River Indian Reservation in Wyoming; and the Montana Book Award honored Where Elk Roam, about Jackson Hole's famous elk herd. Tonight, Bruce is going to show us some photographs from and talk about the subject of his latest book, Life on the Rocks, which won 2 National Outdoor Book Awards in 2014. And he also has a few copies here for interested folks afterwards. With that, I would like to welcome Dr. Smith to our lecture series.
Can everybody hear me? Is this working where I've got it all the way in the back? Good. If something goes wrong, don't be afraid to let me know. Oh, I got to start off first. This is my sidekick. It's called Billy the Kid. He goes wherever I go. Kids love him, but older people sometimes do too, so don't be concerned about that. Well, Natalie gave me a very nice introduction, and I appreciate that. She could have just said I'm an old goat, and I would have liked that just as well. Because it seems like so long ago when I first was learning about this beautiful creature and then living among them, and literally living among them for a good share of, well, about 2.5 years, I guess. And so thanks to Natalie and also Rachel James. I don't know if Rachel's here tonight or not. Not tonight.
3-year-old.
Okay. Well, she gets thanked in her absence because she's the one that actually invited me to be part of the Wilderness Lecture Series, which I was really pleased that I got to do this and to speak to an audience that is really interested in wilderness, or at least I hope you are, and secondarily in mountain goats. This animal is really a wilderness icon. I mean, if you think about animals that are tied and bound to wilderness, this is one that should come to mind right off, like wolverines and hoary marmots and willow ptarmigans and white-tailed ptarmigans, animals like that. It is in a real rich environment in terms of having huge diversity, but there's a lot of specialists that live in the alpine, and the mountain goat is one of the most important. The Wilderness Act was signed into law by President Lyndon Johnson on September 3rd, 1964. Most of you know that. It happened after 60-some drafts of the legislation and 8 years to complete the work. It was quite an ordeal and something I think we can all be proud of just because of some of the luminaries that were involved in doing it and what it's produced for us across our country. And when Johnson signed the act, he made this following statement I came across a few weeks ago when I was putting this talk together. Quote, "If future generations are to remember us with gratitude rather than contempt, we must leave them a glimpse of the world as it was in the beginning, not just after we got through with it." I like that. This is one of the many, many places that I have camped in the Selway Bitterroot. Maybe not my favorite, but certainly one of the more spectacular ones. And I spoke in Hamilton Saturday night, a similar talk to a really enthusiastic large group down there, sponsored by several conservation organizations. And one of the people who came to my talk, and I was hoping would, was Stewart Ramberg. Most of you know who Stewart Ramberg is. He's the last surviving person who helped craft the Wilderness Act. He was like the right-hand man of Zansner when he was working on it. And then we didn't get to visit much afterwards because there were so many people there and everybody was talking. But on Sunday evening, I got to spend 2 hours with Stewart. And what you also need to know about him, besides the Wilderness Act, is he is a scientist by training and did some of the original work on mountain goats, both in Idaho and Montana, and some of the original work in all of North America. Published a monograph way back in 1955. And so we talked, and when Stewart talks about wildlife, he's talking about wilderness. They are inseparable for him. So after we talked for a while and he got to know me a little better, he pointed at me and he says, "Now it's your turn. You need to go up and tell people whenever you talk to them, we need more wilderness." So that's my message to you from Brandy. This particular location's up at the head of Big Creek Drainage, one of the many canyons on the west side of the Bitterroot Valley. And here we are at the doorstep of both the Selway Bitterroot and the Rattlesnake Range. The Selway Bitterroot is one of the original wilderness areas that was established by the Act in 1964. To me, wilderness areas are bastions of solitude where we can still glimpse wildest nature, even as it existed several thousand years ago in the early Holocene. And there live creatures that neither need us nor do well around us. That, after all, is what separates pine martens and mountain goats from cows and cockapoos. Wildlife lives independently from us. I spent a good share of my career as a federal wildlife biologist studying elk and other remarkable species. Here's a herd of 2,000 elk migrating north through Jackson Hole, headed to Summer Range in the Grand Teton National Park. However, going back 4 decades to when I lived among those shaggy, shy animals, the mountain goat is still the animal that I most enjoy observing, studying, photographing, and talking to other people about. So that, of course, is why I'm still doing that 40 years after I did my graduate work. And I'm pleased, of course, that so many of you showed up tonight, because that must mean that you like or care about mountain goats too. Authors are often asked why they wrote their most recent book. Life on the Rocks came out last summer. It was a book, very simply, that needed to be written, so I wrote it. And fortuitously, it was timed, the release of the book was timed with the anniversary of the Wilderness Act, the 50th anniversary. And so I did a number of lectures and more or less formal presentations like this last year. And the book draws on the work of some really remarkable field biologists who have studied mountain goats over the years, over the decades. And in the book, it's written for a general audience. What I try and do in my work is translate the science of wildlife biology to a general audience, so more people have access to the science without having to deal with how mundane and all the jargon that you often find. And I I did this in a way by also incorporating over 100 color photographs, most of them mine, because I thought if I could get people to just crack the book and even the cover to take a look, then they would pick it up and they would read the conservation message that's in it. So the first book that was written about the biology, behavior, and conservation of mountain goats, how long ago do you think that book came out? Just thinking that we've had books on deer and elk and bears for 100 years. How long ago do you think the first book on mountain goats published on their biology and conservation came out? Do you have a guess? The shy audience. Nobody gets graded.
30 years.
There's somebody who knows way too much. 1983, 32 years ago. And what's startling to me about that is it took that long for anybody to publish a book on mountain goats. It was published by a chap by the name of Douglas Chadwick. He did his master's work in the Swan Range south of Glacier, and at the very same time he was tromping around the Swan Range, I was chasing goats down in the Selway Bitterroot. We both did our masters here at the University of Montana at the same time, and Doug and I are still good friends. And since that book came out in '83, the only other thing that's ever been published in book form for a general audience about mountain goats is a very short photographic collection from Glacier Park. 4 pages of text in the whole book. So it's still a book, I guess, but not a lot of reading to do. And some people like that way. So there may be no other large animal about which so little is known and so little is written as this one right here. And this remains, therefore, a little understood member of our fauna that lives in what I call near anonymity. They're kind of out of sight, out of mind. And so as a result of that, because people tend to direct attention and conservation efforts towards animals that they know about and they care about, this animal has been receiving very little conservation attention, essentially conservation neglect, and trying to change that. That's what compelled me to write Life on the Rocks, to raise the public's attention and affection for this unfamiliar animal and to bring attention to its conservation needs. A secondary reason for writing the book is my 40-year fascination with mountain goats, dating all the way back to 1972, when I saw my first goats clinging to a granite canyon wall in Bass Creek Canyon, just a few miles south of here, in the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness area. Anybody been up Bass Creek Canyon? Yeah, just a beautiful spot. And then, after discovering there was such a creature as this, and feeling like I just wanted to see them as much as I could, I ended up doing a master's project and spending 3 years studying the bitterroot population. Pretty much from Hamilton north was my study area. So about a dozen canyons in all, 6 that I really concentrated on. And since that time, I've continued to learn about and photograph mountain goats in Idaho, Montana, Alberta, British Columbia, and also in the Cascades of Washington, where I took this photograph way back in 1977 when I was a seasonal employee for North Cascades National Park and was doing ground surveys, hiking up trails and ridges to try and census the goats there that summer. Relatively rare is how I would refer to the mountain goat. And I have a little bit of information here. The only table you're going to see that gives you an idea of just how rare this animal is compared to all the other hoofed animals, the ungulate species in North America, as of 2011 data. This is the global population of every one of those species. And you can see only bighorn sheep are less abundant than mountain goats. And when I was putting the book together, it was really kind of shocking to me that there's even more muskox than there are mountain goats. So this is an animal that is not very common. How many are there in Montana? Anybody know? You probably know because you know when that book was published. There's 2,700 according to Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks outside of Glacier, plus the ones in Glacier. So think of that, 2,700. There's that many whitetail in the valley where I live, I think. 26 million of them in North America. Those of you that are familiar with the mountain goat have probably heard it called the Rocky Mountain goat, and that's really a misnomer. And I'll tell you why. On this map, we've got orange blotches and we've got green blotches. The orange is the distribution of native populations of mountain goats, where they've existed for thousands of years. And so, indeed, mountain goats do live in the Rocky Mountains because we have them right here in the Rattlesnake and the Bitterroot and other places in Montana. So they're in Idaho and Montana up into Alberta, British Columbia. But that's not where most of the mountain goats are. Most of the mountain goats that exist are in the coast ranges of Alaska, Yukon, and down through British Columbia, and then also scattered numbers through the Cascades of Washington. Then let's talk about the green places just a bit. This is Kodiak Island. This is the Olympic Peninsula. Those are places where mountain goats have been introduced, places where they haven't been for many hundreds, if not thousands of years, and really there's no evidence they were ever in either of those places thousands of years ago. And then if we come down, a little hard to see from here, but Oregon, Nevada, I think I'm in Utah, Colorado, Wyoming, and that's the Black Hills of South Dakota. 6 states in which there are mountain goats that were transplanted, captured in native populations and transplanted and put in places where they haven't been. So the total distribution of mountain goats is shown there, introduced and native. And in all, there's 14 jurisdictions, Canadian provinces and territories and states where there's mountain goats. Let's look at Montana because that's what we're most interested in. If you look here on the west side of the state, it's all orange blotches, all native goats on the west side of the Continental Divide, except there are native goat populations in the Pioneers, in the Beaverhead Range, and on the Rocky Mountain front as well, just on the east side of the divide. But all of these green areas over here, this is the Beartooth Absaroka, all of these green areas over here are also introduced populations, places like the Highwood Mountains, the Crazies. I mentioned the Beartooth Absaroka, the Madison Range, and those goats actually dispersed on their own to the Gallatin Range. The Highlands, the Snowcrests, the tobacco roots right behind my house. Those are all places that goats never were, but they were introduced by Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. The scientific name of the mountain goat is Oreamnos americanus. And the specific name, americanus, is very straightforward. It's an American mountain goat. And I was getting at the point there, it's a misnomer to call it the Rocky Mountain goat. The correct name is mountain goat or American mountain goat because it's not just in the Rockies. Now the genus, if you translate that from the Greek to English, it means lamb of the mountain, suggesting it's a sheep, which it's not. It's also not a goat. It's not a goat. It's actually in its own tribe, which is a phylogenetic division lower than a subfamily with very, very few species in it. And they're kind of a cross between true goats and antelope. They have characteristics of both groups of hoofed animals. So this animal is truly an evolutionary novelty. It's the only member of its genus. It's the only individual that looks like this. Some would say, well, the Dall sheep, but if you know what a Dall sheep looks like, it's very different looking than a mountain goat. And it's also different in appearance and behavior than its only living relatives that are all inhabitants, not of the New World, but of the Old World. So let's look at who the mountain goat's relatives are. Some crazy looking dudes. Let's start in the upper left. This is a Chinese Corral, G-O-R-A-L. These are very reclusive animals, much like the mountain goat, but in places that are even harder to access in some cases than where mountain goats are. According to the taxonomy, there's maybe 4 species of Corrals. They weigh up to maybe 70 pounds. They're not very big. They're stocky, short-legged, short-necked, little tiny horns you can see up there, actually shorter than a mountain goat's horns, but they have kind of a pronounced tail on them. And the most interesting of the Corrals is called the long-tailed Corral. And what's most interesting about it is not its tail, but where it lives. It lives in one place only, the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea. There are no people there, but plenty of long-tailed Corrals. Tells us something. In the upper right, this animal that whenever I see it, I think it should be hugged. That big ruff around its neck. That's a Japanese serow, S-E-R-O-W. And again, depending upon which taxonomist you talk to, there's anywhere from 3 to 6 species of serows. Like the Corrals, they all occupy Asia from the mountains of southern Siberia, southeastern Siberia, down through the Tibetan Plateau into Southeast Asia. And there's actually one species of serow that I think is on Sumatra, probably a separate species. And then the serow species that's on the Japanese archipelago, which separated from the mainland, and this animal became geographically isolated and genetically distinct many, many years ago. I think that broke off about 1.5 million years ago. So those are the animals that really, if you can say anything looks like a mountain goat, those two look closest like a mountain goat. And then down here, this is the one, if you've seen a relative of a mountain goat, this is the one you probably saw, who's been to Europe and seen this. Nobody's been to Europe and seen a European chamois. 2 species of chamois. They're in the Alps, they're in the Pyrenees, they're in the Apennine Mountains, they're in the Caucasus, and a couple of other lesser ranges. They're doing quite well. The serows and the Corrals, several of those species are threatened with extinction because of habitat fragmentation, habitat damage, and outright exploitation, overexploitation. But the chamois is doing quite well, at least at this point in time. And it's different than the other ones and different than the mountain goat because the body is built more lightly. It has these really long legs. It's extremely nimble, and it's a prodigious leaper. It can do 20, 25-foot bounds. So if you ever get to Austria or Switzerland or the Pyrenees Mountains, you're going to want to look for this guy. What do we have in the lower right? This is a quiet crowd. Muskox. Thank you. I'm glad you're here. So, is this a relative of the mountain goat? No, it's not. But of every large mammal in North America, this is the one that genetically is the closest related, as different as it looks. So the mountain goat's not more closely related to bighorn sheep or Dall sheep than it is to the muskox. The beauty of molecular biology. All of these species likely evolved from a common ancestor, these species, and the mountain goat, likely evolved from a common ancestor in Central Asia. And we believe that ancestral mountain goats came to this continent between 40,000 and 100,000 years ago across the Bering Land Bridge, like so many of the animals that live here. Moose and deer and black bear and wolverines and on. And they came across the Bering Land Bridge during the Pleistocene. And of course, we know at that time, global sea levels were about 300 feet lower than they are now, creating the land bridge between Siberia, the Chamchatina peninsula and the Alaskan peninsula because so much of the water was locked up in ice. Goats have evolved numerous specialized adaptations to survive in a really harsh environment. If you spend time up there in the winter, and for a mountain goat, winter is 6 months long, you know that. Among those adaptations is this elegant pelage. It accomplishes two things. It distinguishes the mountain goat from other species for biologists like myself. It helps them be extremely cold adapted, but it also makes them really photogenic. Would you disagree with that? They're wonderful animals to try and photograph, especially in the right lighting conditions, and especially when they're in their full pelage like this, because they shut out and look much different in the summer. And what I want to do is read you a little bit from the book about these adaptations. Just a short bit here. The mountain goat is defined by a suite of traits that permit it to defy gravity 12 months a year. Specialization starts with the feet. The hard outer walls of the hooves surround a rough yet pliable convex pad that actually protrudes from the outer wall of the hoof. The animal world's equivalent of studded tires, the hoof pads conform to rock surfaces providing positive traction. The four toes, digits 2 and 3 comprising the cloven hoof and digits 1 and 4 being the elevated dew claws at the rear of the hoof, are oversized, a feature that affords a larger gripping surface and distributes the foot load for increased support on snow. The cloven hoof is more flexible than in other ungulates. As a goat descends a rocky face or a steep snowfield, the toes spread apart, improving balance and providing friction in an outward as well as downward direction. During descents, the goat lowers his hindquarters to bring the large dew claws into contact with rock and snow, increasing traction and control. His overall build includes short, stocky legs like the Corrals and Serows, set relatively close together, and a compact torso with the forequarters decidedly larger than the rear. The heavily muscled shoulders and forelegs help him trudge through deep snow. A compact body provides a low center of gravity, balance, and uncanny agility on narrow ledges that vanish into thin air. When startled, he may trot or lope, but this is not an animal built for speed. Although nimble in the mountains by hoofed animal standards, North America's Dall, Stone, and Bighorn sheep possess neither the physical adaptations nor the raw ability of the mountain goat on cliffs and crags. While sheep bound crisply across outcrops and slopes, the goat is a plodder and inclined to stick to steeper terrain. Leverage, friction, and balance are the tools of his trade. The sheep are free climbing scramblers. The goat is a technician. I've watched a goat climb to the top of a dizzying pinnacle and stand with all 4 feet together on a summit that measured 8 inches square. Then he raised the hind foot, scratched behind an ear, shook the dust from his coat, unimpressed with the feat as I looked on in wonder. Goats perform really amazing feats of mountaineering, like no other animal. And some of those I describe in the book, like the one I just mentioned, but also how they accomplish climbing places that I found I couldn't follow them. I could have if I'd had ropes and pitons and everything, but to try and free climb what they do is extremely difficult. Although they live at high altitudes where winter may last half of the year, the real key features of the places they inhabit are that they are steep and they're rugged. That's the signature aspect of their habitat. This niche has buffered goats from both competition and predation over the years. And maybe more than any other hoofed animal, mountain goats are resistant to significant predation because of the suite of adaptations that they have to live in this steep country. It puts most of the predators or potential predators at a distinct disadvantage. So contrary to what, how many of you know who Gary Larson, the cartoonist, is? Most of you. He's not doing cartoons anymore, which I find to be a huge disappointment. He was actually trained as a wildlife biologist and became a cartoonist. And what he does in his cartoons that I like is he looks at humans through animals' eyes and the foolishness of our lives. So contrary to what he would have us believe, the greatest natural threat to mountain goats is not irresponsible behavior. Irresponsible mountain goats. And so we have a line of 4 of them winding their way up a narrow ledge, and the second one casually throwing the banana peel over his shoulder. So rather than irresponsible behavior being the greatest threat to goats, it's actually severe winter weather and the mountains themselves. Food scarcity in winter, avalanches, and falls. Yes, falls. Winter severity, if we think about mortality of a mountain goat population on an annual cycle, the annual mortality is going to be most closely related to how severe winter is, that's 6 months. Severity for mountain goats is deep, wet snow and persistent snow. How long does winter last? Because like so many animals, during the summer, it lays on body fat. And a lot of what it's living off from the calories it requires during the winter are in that fat. The longer winter lasts, the more likely they'll run out of fat. So the duration of winter is very important, as well as how much snow there is. Snow is important, not only because of the energy it takes to move through it, just locomotion, but also to get through it to get food. And because of avalanches, which sweep many mountain goats off mountainsides from March to May. This year, they're lucking out. I was just down in the Bitterroot for the last 2 days, and it looks to me like about late April down there this year. So I suspect mountain goats fared quite well this winter. But even if there aren't avalanches, if you spend 365 days a year up on those cliffs and crags, you're bound to make a mistake. And so climbing accidents are also a significant cause of mortality in goats. And the other thing about that, from the aspect of population biology, is that mortality is highest in the first 2 years in a goat population. So the kids, the animals up to a year old, and then the yearlings. And in really severe winters, half of the kids will never see their first birthday. So because of all those dangers, there's one more aspect of the mountain goat that is required to survive up there for a 10 or 12-year lifespan, if you're fortunate enough to make it that long before your teeth wear out. And that is patience. It may be the greatest attribute for a life that's spent on the rocks. And I want to read you one more short section here about that characteristic of the mountain goat. A finely tuned specialist, America's goat antelope inhabits a realm where the vertical dimension supersedes all others. My persistently cocked head and uplifted binoculars attested to that. Although equipped with magnificent physical adaptations, the mental game is where goats may best excel. That became what I most admired during countless days watching these cliff dwellers negotiate their vertical world. Rock climbing requires a combination of strength, skill, and competence, can-do attitude. To successfully spend a 10 to 12-year lifespan on cliffs requires one other ingredient: patience. Natural selection and diligent parental training have given the mountain goat remarkable patience. Goats choose their routes. Their climbing is methodical, even painstaking. They are not averse to abandoning a route and seeking an alternative should the footing turn treacherous. And I've watched that many times. Nope, bad decision, I'll go this other way. Goats can perform what I call walkovers. When a cliff narrows to nothingness, they follow a ledge, and all of a sudden that ledge just evaporates into a 75-foot vertical drop, and straight above them is another vertical cliff face. A quick lurch to position his 4 feet above the cliff face, followed by walking the feet above the head across the rock, and he's ambling back along the same ledge, nibbling sedges and groundsels. While studying mountain goats in Montana's Bitterroot Mountains again and again, I was amazed by their patience. High on the cliffs one winter day, I stalked a nanny I wanted to immobilize with my dart gun and then radio collar. I planned my stalk from the canyon bottom to the ledge where she was feeding, some 1,000 feet of elevation above me. An hour later, she and I met on the ledge. Startled, she bounded out of sight before I could get off a shot. I waited several minutes and then followed. Just beyond an angle in the cliff, where the ledge ended in a 75-foot vertical drop, she stood facing me. I couldn't immobilize her there for fear she would plummet from the ledge when she lost control of her limbs. So I retreated some 50 yards and sat, dart gun ready, behind a large boulder. Surely she would retrace her steps, and I dart her as she passed by. Well, 3 hours later, with the sun sinking in Idaho, my hands and feet numb, and my patience played out, she remained at the same location. I bid her good night before descending back down to the canyon bottom in the twilight. The next morning, at sunrise, from the canyon bottom, I spotted her, grazing near the boulder where I had waited. So, goats have persevered in this really harsh environment for thousands of generations. And you should have 2 questions about this picture. How did it get there and why? At least I have those 2 questions. This is in Glacier. So they've survived despite avalanches and the treachery of the mountain itself in terms of falls, climbing accidents, deep snow, and so forth. But the impacts of Euro-Americans, people like us, are very recent. And the second half of the book goes into the continental distribution of goats, how many there are, how that's changed over recent decades, and also it talks about the conservation challenges, particularly related to human influence. In southern British Columbia, Alberta, Washington, and parts of Idaho and Montana, overharvesting of goats during hunting seasons has been acknowledged by wildlife managers and biologists as one factor contributing to population declines. And you'll remember that it was only a little more than a century ago that we nearly lost most of the large mammal species in North America. Elk, there were 10 million elk at one time, reduced to 50,000 by 1900. Pronghorn were reduced from nearly 10 million down to about 13,000. And maybe the classic one is what happened to bison. So mountain goats, in a sense, escaped a lot of that just because of where they live, by virtue of being in inaccessible places. But that has been changing over the last 50, 60, 70 years. And one of the things that contributed to this overharvesting was motorized vehicles and the expansion of road systems, often associated with logging, mining, energy development, and so forth. And although we think of mountain goats, or I think of mountain goats as a wilderness species, much of their winter range in many places, including the Selway Bitterroot, for example, are not protected by wilderness designation, as they have to drop down to get out of the snows up at 8,000 and 9,000, 10,000 feet where they summer, because up there the snow is deeper than a house, and they come down to the lower cliffs, and they do this in many parts of their range across North America. They often leave national parks or wilderness areas. They're on national forest land, but it doesn't have the legal protection that wilderness does. And so all sorts of other multiple uses can occur there. And when populations of goats, and they tend to live in these very small populations, often not metapopulations, but really small individual populations in a given mountain range. When populations have been depressed, they've often been slow to rebound, and sometimes they don't. And there's many populations right now in the southern part of their range that are very depressed and have been for some time in terms of numbers, where we begin to worry about like small population effects, inbreeding, depression, and so forth. Most jurisdictions that manage mountain goats now don't allow hunting unless there's at least 50 animals in a population. Still a very small number. And Washington State just changed a few years ago, and they only allow hunting when a population is known to have at least 100 animals. But the problem with this is a scarcity of population data. You can't make good management decisions if you don't have good data. Mountain goats are hard to survey and extremely expensive to survey, because you can't send a biologist or a graduate student into every little narrow pathway up in a wilderness area to count these goats. And helicopter surveys, which is how most of it's done, are very expensive. So another thing is that studies in Montana, Idaho, Washington, Alberta, British Columbia, and Alaska have demonstrated that goats are much more sensitive than other hoofed mammals to disturbance by ORVs, snowmobiles, aircraft, and even skiers. Goats are especially sensitive to helicopter overflights. They're just petrified sometimes when a helicopter will come over. And one of the predators of mountain goats is the golden eagle. And those of us who have worked on mountain goats just sort of think of it that this must be the most badass eagle that has ever been, you know, that's coming after me, when they hear that rotor getting louder and louder. And so they will run, which in itself is dangerous. They'll hide under cliff ledges, they'll tremble beneath trees, and so forth. And we don't know physiologically exactly what that's doing to them, but it can't be good. It's burning excess energy, if nothing else, and probably pumping a lot of adrenaline through their bloodstream. Goats are especially sensitive to these helicopter overflights, and it can displace them from the habitat that they're in to places that are less suitable. There's a retired Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks biologist by the name of Gail Joslin. She did the last study of a native goat population in Montana outside of Glacier over on the Rocky Mountain front during the 1980s. And she had one study area where had been leased for exploration for oil and gas, and the seismic testing was done by hundreds and hundreds of overflights by helicopters. And a parallel area that didn't get leased. So she could do that comparison. And the population where all of these helicopter overflights occurred had reduced reproduction and reduced survival of the goat population, and the population started in a downward trend. That's also been shown time and again in Alberta, where a lot of research is going on. So these kind of human impacts require management by land manager and wildlife managers at a local or regional level. But as I wrote in Life in the Rocks, and I'll quote, "I can make the case that lands where wolverines, hoary marmots, and mountain goats breathe and breed most clearly define a mountain wilderness. Indeed, the single most effective conservation policy for sustaining goat herds may be formal designation of wilderness, or at least forbidding motorized travel in mountain goat range." There's a few places that have started doing some of this. This sign reads, "Entering mountain goat wintering area, please stay on road for next 1.5 miles. That sign is one of several over in the Sawtooth National Recreation Area in central Idaho. And starting in 2002, the Forest Service started working with the public and saying, hey, the goats up on those cliffs have nowhere else to go in the winter, but people do. So if you can at least, when you enter this drainage, just stay to the roadway or the marked trail, that'll be an opportunity for you to see some pretty country, but the goats to not be displaced and stressed by you. And the really remarkable thing is 30 years earlier than that, in the 1970s, the U.S. Forest Service in the Sawtooth National Recreation Area banned heliskiing over winter ranges where goats are. I would like to give them a round of applause. That needs to happen more places, not just for mountain goats, but for wolverines and other species that live in those kinds of lands. But these are sort of conservation challenges that are anthropogenic in origin, of human doing, on local or regional scales. Then there are these challenges mountain goats face on a global scale and other species face on a global scale. And of course, I'm talking about climate change. Temperatures are rising 2 to 3 times faster at the highest latitudes and the highest altitudes, which means where the mountain goat lives or the polar bear lives. And as a result of that, we're seeing changes in temperature since 1950 in mountain goat range of on the order of 5 degrees, and the Alps 7 degrees. That's a huge change when you think about what's happened over geologic time in a blink. So these are bound to have effects on these cold adapted species. This photo was taken in Glacier, Apakuni Basin. Anyone ever been to Apakuni Basin? No? Out of the mini glacier drainage? Yeah, really cool spot. Good place to see goats, by the way. Yeah. And what's happening there is what's happening throughout so much of the Rockies. Heat-stressed conifers like lodgepole pine and whitebark pine are becoming more and more vulnerable to the pathogens and parasites that can attack them. We're talking about mountain pine beetle in the case of whitebark pine, pine blister rust. Back in Yellowstone, I'm told now that half of all the whitebark pine, which is the highest elevation conifer species, tree species that occurs there, half of all the whitebark pine in Yellowstone Park is now either dead or dying. And I talked to a couple of biologists in Glacier. They said we're not very far from whitebark pine being functionally extinct in Glacier, unless something turns around pretty rapidly. So this is just one of many places you could get pictures like this of conifers. And across the Rockies in the lower 48 states, mountain pine beetle has now infested 46 million acres of coniferous forests. Some are already dead, some are going to be. And of course, when that happens and they die, they become tinder for wildfires. Wildfire seasons are getting longer all the time, about 3 weeks longer than they were just 50 years ago. And so when those forests burn, they burn more intensely, and we put all this CO2 in the air, and it just kind of is a vicious cycle. What does that have to do with mountain goat? Well, I talk about that in the book, the things that we think it will do to mountain goats. But there's no research going on with mountain goats. There's way more research going on with wolverines and pikas than there is with mountain goats. We know they're cold adapted. They use glaciers and they use snowfields for thermal regulation to stay away from pests. And most importantly, right at the edge of where the snow is melting, it's a garden that's constantly being irrigated as the snow melts back. And because of that, that water and the ground becoming bare, you get brand new growth of all sorts of plants coming up on a continuing pattern through the summer and fall. That's the most nutritious vegetation that mountain goats can eat. It's the least lignified, highest in protein, most digestible. As we lose snowfields and glaciers, that season when they can get that highly nutritious forage will be much shorter. Have any of you seen on the Geographic Channel the documentary film Chasing Ice? Rick has. How many of you have seen Chasing Ice? Spectacular cinematography. James Balog did the photography. He narrates most of it. And what he did is go to most every continent and document what's happening to the glaciers in real time. Of course, we have satellite imagery that tells us about that too. But his comment in regard to glaciers is that they are the canary in the coal mine of the climate change debate. We can see it in real time happening. And these glaciers and snowfields have always been part of the mountain goat's habitat. So if you go to Glacier again, Many Glacier Drainage, you go in the Many Glacier Hotel, there's a whole wall, 2 walls maybe, that have these paired photos of the glaciers in Montana's iconic national park. This one happens to be Sperry Glacier. The photo was taken in 1913. That's why it's black and white. And down below we have, not quite 100 years later, in 2005. And I could have put up a pair from any one of those that was there. In the book I have, I think it's Jackson Glacier also. This little tarn down here, lake in a cirque basin, didn't exist up here because there were 200 feet of ice on it just 100 years earlier. In 1850, there were 150 glaciers in Glacier National Park. Today, there are how many? And how many?
24.
Yep, 24 or 25, yep, somewhere in there. This is still considered a glacier. The only ice is there and there. I'm not quite sure why it's still a glacier, but 24 or 25. And at the rate they're disappearing, and the warming is accelerating the snow melt and the ice melt across all the continents, Glacier will become unglacier or formerly Glacier Park by 2030. Just think about that. We're all going to probably be alive then when that happens. So this is just one of those challenges that's going to affect the mountain goat in ways that we probably can't even think about how to measure all the aspects of it, and there certainly isn't the money to do it. Earlier this year marked kind of a key moment in climate change history that few of us probably remembered. I did some research again for this talk, and I found that just last month, on February 8th, it marked the 50th anniversary of the first presidential mention of the environmental risk of how humans are changing our planet's atmospheric conditions. 50 years ago. 3 weeks after Lyndon Johnson was inaugurated in 1965, he addressed the U.S. Congress what he called his message on conservation and restoration of natural beauty. The whole House and Senate were all there for him to give a speech just on this topic. In it, he warned, quote, "Air pollution is no longer confined to isolated places. This generation has altered the composition of the atmosphere at a global scale through radioactive materials." Of course, we were in the Cold War then, and there was concern about radiation fallout from all the nuclear tests. And, he said, a steady increase in carbon dioxide from the burning of fossil fuels. That was 50 years ago. Our president warned us we have no excuses. This is taken, have any of you been to eastern Idaho's Palisades Wilderness Study Area? Yeah, cool place, huh? I spent a lot of time in there photographing mountain goats in the winter. For tens of thousands of years, this animal has persisted amid snow and wind and bitter cold, seemingly defying gravity in the places it lives. But since 1950, numbers of mountain goats have declined in British Columbia by 50%. Now, you remember I showed you that table earlier that there's only 100,000 mountain goats left in North America? 50 years ago, there were 100,000 in British Columbia. Today, there's 50,000. Half that population, the mountain goat stronghold, disappeared during that time. And in the state of Washington, 60% of the mountain goats have disappeared in the last 60 years. And most people have no idea this is going on. They're still being treated with neglect, I would say, and in many cases still being hunted without knowing the full effects of how that might be a cumulative effect on all the natural causes of mortality. So let me give you an example. in Montana, where we've really fared a little bit better. If we look at the last 30 years, because goats have been hunted all that time, the harvest on an annual basis, the hunting and the take each fall, has stayed at about 200 to 240 mountain goats. So based on that, we'd say, hey, things are doing okay here. You know, it's stagnant, it's stable. But it really masks what's going on, because during that time, the number of permits issued in the mountain goats native range, all these areas west of the Continental Divide, plus the Rocky Mountain front, the Pioneers and the Beaverhead Range, has fallen dramatically. Out of 294 permits issued for mountain goats last year, only 38 were in areas where they've been native for thousands of years. All the rest are in these introduced populations. And mountain goats that have been introduced tend to do pretty well for a while. They're going in kind of a pristine environment. They usually don't have any competitors there. There may be fewer predators, and because it's on the east side of the Continental Divide, the winters tend to be more mild. But only 38 permits are now issued for mountain goats in all of their native ranges in Montana. When I was working in the Bitterroots in the 1970s, just 40 years ago, just in the one hunting district that I worked in, there were 75 permits. Now there's half of that in the whole range of the mountain goats. And the question is, was that done proactively by wildlife managers to try and limit the decline in mountain goats, or was it done reactively because they knew mountain goat populations were declining? We don't even know the answer to that question. So to reverse this trend that apparently is occurring, not just in Montana, but throughout the mountain goat southern range, we need to better understand how we are affecting this species and how we're affecting its environment. Places we formerly regarded as being immune from human impact, including national wilderness areas. Life on the Rocks was my effort to acquaint more and more people with this animal, and I'm hoping that it becomes more familiar to more people, hoping that you and many others will get out in the mountains, and while you're recreating, whatever you may be doing there, thinking about mountain goats. These are places where mountain goats live. Try and spot some, and when you do, take some time to watch them. They're patient, which also means their life kind of moves in slow motion, but trust me, if you watch them long enough, they'll do something exciting. Hopefully not fall off a cliff. And of course, it's only by doing that where we get that connection with the animal as well as where it lives, where we become advocates for its conservation. And you can do that in all sorts of ways, whether it's promoting more wilderness in places where that is an appropriate designation for the land, or weighing in on conservation of mountain goats, becoming advocates for the animal. To illustrate how I've come to think over my 45-year career as a wildlife biologist, how I've come to think about conservation of wild things and wild places, wild nature, if you will, I want to close by sharing with you the epilogue of my book, Life on the Rocks. Only by spending intense time can you know and develop real intimacy with a place. In doing so, you begin to discover features, relations, and worth that casual visitors seldom see. The place, whether a Midwest marsh or New England woodlot, coastal estuary or Pacific headland, prairie potholes or desert canyons, then becomes part of you, and you become part of it. This connection is the germ and nourishment of conservation passion, not merely half-hearted advocacy. My time in the Bitterroots cut a deep swath in my person. That wedge of the mountain goats realm became a kindred domicile. Besides the grand features named on U.S. Geological Survey maps, smaller folds and twists in the landscape earn their own names that lodged in my lexicon. Cave Canyon, Maybilly Cliffs, and Nixon's Nose. Richard Nixon was president then. Those became cousins of the grand peaks that geographers had coined Castle Craig, Sky Pilot, and the Heavenly Twins. This familiarity fondly endures nearly 4 decades after closing my winter camp in Fredberg Canyon. Since then, fires have swept the timbered slopes. Thickets have replaced abandoned beaver ponds only to be cropped by more beaver. And generations of mountain goats have come and gone. Yet the mesmerizing complexity and spirit of the land lives on. A sign in the gym where I exercise reads, "If you don't take care of your body, where will you live?" So too, we must nurture the mountain to nurture the mountain goat. This is only to say that all life is a product of the land, something wildlife ecologist Aldo Leopold illustrated so eloquently in his writings over half a century ago. The land, weather, and DNA have conspired in bearing a bounty of life so diverse that each year field biologists catalog new species, even as others become destined for the boneyard of the extinct. Some varieties are so beguiling, so reminiscent of ourselves in form or behavior, or so awe-inspiring in the feats they perform, that in admiration we elevate them above others in our value system. In that respect, the mountain goat does us double duty. It recreates us spiritually, but may also serve as protector of a tapestry of species that share its high country home. Over the millennia, natural selection, the maestro of how life forms have come to be, has orchestrated sinew and snow and gravity and grit into a masterpiece, a beast of rock and wool. Our American mountain goat. Every facet of its being shouts that it wants to just live in high and solitary. And it will if we but let it. So if I haven't put anyone to sleep and I didn't hear any heads hit the tables in front of you, I'd be glad to hear your thoughts or even a question or two. Yes?
Yeah, I've got a question about wilderness is supposed to be natural and untrammeled. And in your maps, you point out a lot of populations that are introduced in wilderness. So what are your feelings about introduced goats in wilderness areas? They're unnatural and it's trammeled.
Yeah, they're an exotic there in a sense. I mean, they're native to the continent, but they're exotic from that landscape is the point you're making. Did anyone hear that? He's saying, what are your feelings about introducing mountain goats into places they never were? I mean, we all have thoughts about the introduction of exotic species unintentionally, think of spotted knapweed or carp. But when we intentionally do that into new places, that's sort of a different way of thinking about it. Well, I'm not a big proponent of it, as much as I love mountain goats, which you may have detected. And the reason is because many of those mountain ranges where mountain goats have been introduced were native locations for bighorn sheep, which had become exterminated there for one reason or another. They winked out. Bighorn sheep are having problems in a lot of their range. We know about that with the disease issues and so forth. But I still have a hard time justifying giving up on what was native there and saying, this is good enough. As great as the mountain goat is. And what's happening in Montana, I think to some degree, and I even think biologists from the department would agree with me, the State Department, is that we're neglecting what's happening to the native goats because we got enough over there on the east side of the Continental Divide. I want to know why, when I go into Blodgett Canyon now, I can only find 3 goats like I did on Sunday, rather than the 15 or 20 I did just 40 years ago. Or Mill Creek yesterday, where I saw the whole wall, south-facing wall of Mill Creek, from up on the south rim, about 1,800 feet above the canyon bottom. It gave me this amazing view, and I couldn't find one. And the state biologist flew that in February and found just one. I think that's what we need to focus on. So I'm not a big proponent of putting mountain goats or other species where they aren't native, because I think it's avoids working on the real issues there and what has happened to the native species, fauna or flora, whatever it may be. And you had a question, yes?
Yeah, for 30 years, I spent a good portion of the summer on a glacial horn, the southern end of the Bitterroot Selway, Frank Church River, no return, fire lookout, Salmon Mountain. And it's on that glacial horn at 9,000 feet. There's 2 cirque basins. Virtually every summer for 2 decades, we would see at least a couple of families of mountain goats. And for the last decade, we've seen virtually none. And it just flabbergasts me, astounds me. I feel incredulous to the fact that Idaho still allows hunting of mountain goats in that area when clearly, without any question, there's been a massive decline of the goats. And it's just incomprehensible how it continues. Is it political pressure by outfitters and those who want to bag a goat that keep the permits going, and clearly the decimation of the few animals continuing?
I hear you. Yeah, I feel the same way you do. You know, when I go to these places that you and I have enough longevity that we can make those comparisons across time, and we can sort of repeat what we did then. Go the same time, look the same places. We still can see. I can still spot goats. They simply aren't there in the numbers they used to be. I probably won't take that question on directly, because right now I'm working with Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. We just got funding to go ahead and do summarize, synthesize, and analyze all of the management and population data for all the goat populations in Montana for the last 50 years. It's never been done. So as a scientist, I don't want to be, you know, saying what I think is happening, because I don't know either. I have to look at the data, and that hasn't happened. And likewise, that should happen in Idaho. I don't know if anyone over there is taking that on. But you probably feel like I do. When you go in the wilderness, it's empty without mountain goats.
Yeah, and the animals obviously don't know the boundary between Idaho and Montana. It's good news to hear that Montana's doing something with that consideration in mind. But I have a feeling like Idaho might still be living in stone ages of preservation or even cultivation of the nearly extinct goats.
Yeah.
And do you have any sense of you know, it's a gargantuous, the biggest ecosystem south of Alaska in wilderness, so they ought to be considering it then by state, like Montana and Idaho together, obviously, but that apparently isn't happening.
I don't know. I really can't answer that. It should, of course. When you have migratory elk herds going over, you know, in the vicinity of Wagon Hammer Creek, Lost Trail Pass, places like that, Idaho and Montana do coordinate, because animals that winter one place, some of them may be in the other state during the hunting season. And the same thing should happen with mountain goats. Whether it is, I don't know. But I can tell you, I studied, you know, goats on the Montana side of the Bitterroots, and I spent one whole summer, fall, every week from the 3rd week of May until I got snowed out at the end of October in that high country, all the way by the Bitterroot Divide many times. And I watched goats going back and forth from Idaho to Montana. Where they wintered, I don't know, because they weren't marked, but they certainly don't care if it's Idaho or Montana. Yeah. Somebody else had a question. Yes?
You mentioned predation by golden eagles on mountain goat kids. I was wondering how big a role predation plays on mountain goats, and what are the major predators?
Well, predation on mountain goats by golden eagles. Can they? Yes. Have they been documented doing it? Yes. And it's really pretty much limited to, I would guess, the first couple weeks that a mountain goat's alive. How big do you think a mountain goat is when it's born? How much does it weigh?
A couple hundred pounds.
It is bigger than this. How many pounds did somebody say?
4 pounds.
Yeah, they're actually a little bigger than that. They weigh 6 to 7 pounds. They're like a little puppy, a little fluff ball, and then you see them out in the snowfields, and they're bouncing around like popcorn kernels, you know. It's like, be careful, it's steep down there. And their mothers are right there, they're doting mothers. They're paying attention to them every minute. In fact, when they go across a steep cliff like this, the nanny, as you saw in that one picture, she puts herself on the side down below the kid, so if it has a fall, she's there to block it. So amazing. And likewise, golden eagles can knock those small kids off from cliffs. If you know, the thermals are right, they could probably pick up a brand new kid and carry it away. They would have enough lift. But more often probably what happens, and there's a couple, maybe 3 instances where in the literature where goats have actually been seen to be killed by eagles, more often they just bat them and knock them off a ledge, and then they feed on them down below. But they have a hard time doing it. And the reason they have a hard time doing it is because they have really good mothers, maybe the best. And what the nannies do is, the little kid's here, he's not sure what's going on, and mom stands right over the top of the kid, right underneath her belly. And then she just stands there defiantly with those little daggers on her head and says, come on, you want a piece of me? And they're so patient, they'll just stay there. And the eagle finally wears himself out and just gives up. They'll stoop on them, but if the nanny is not an inexperienced nanny and tries to charge towards the eagle, the kid's safe. So that's really an insignificant factor in mortality. Cougars are probably the best adapted. Certainly they take mountain goats. When I was working down there, I never saw it. There were certainly lions. I tracked lions. In 3 winters in there, I never saw a lion. I just couldn't pick one out. I saw coyotes trying to take mountain goats, eagles, even a black bear once. I guess I'm not good at spotting lions. I've seen them all since then. But they're the best adapted, and 2 different outfitters told me about instances of lions killing goats, and there's no doubt they are the best adapted for that. Coyotes, not up there. They would have to get one out in the meadow somewhere with an inattentive nanny, because they will gore you. There's a record of mountain goats goring a wolverine, mountain goats goring a black bear, and the black bear and the wolverine didn't come out of that very well. In places in British Columbia and Alberta and Alaska where mountain goats travel through forested areas quite a bit, wolves and grizzly bears can be significant predators. And most of the time when goats are doing that, it would be more over, if you remember that map, over in those coast ranges where you have that Pacific influence, all the snow and moisture, those amazing old growth forests. And mountain goats are wintering on little outcrops in the mountains, and then if they move to another one, they have to go through the timber. Well, in the winter, of course, the bears are hibernating, but the wolves aren't. So that's a place where they can get them. And also, mountain goats really like salt, starting in May, and then June and July, like the Walton Salt Lick on the south side of Glacier. Some of you have seen goats there at the Goat Lick. In British Columbia, they've been, radioed ones have been documented to go 30 miles through the forest to get to a natural salt lick. So that's an opportunity for bears or wolves to be effective predators. But overall, in most studies, it's the other things that are more hazards. But someone else had a question.
How's the introduced population of bears doing? Are they increasing or decreasing?
They're going gangbusters over there. Yeah, and you know, they were introduced, Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks has introduced over 500 mountain goats starting in 1941. The last transplant was maybe, I don't know, 5-10 years ago, something like that. Those animals were introduced either in the late 40s or early 50s. They did great. They spread out like molecules filling a vacuum, actually are in Wyoming as well. And managers actually have to think about introduced populations very differently than native ones. Introduced ones, the nannies will sometimes have twins. Native populations, almost never. In introduced populations, most nannies will reach reproductive age, primiparacy, earlier at 3 years of age. In native populations, some nannies won't reproduce for the first time until they're 5. And if they only live till 10 and half of their babies die, they might only be able to add 2 or 3 animals to the population during their lifetime, if they live to be 10. and hunted goats usually don't get to be that old. So those things are different. And the other thing is, in native populations, goats seem to be anchored to the same pile of rocks or the same seasonal ranges, and they're really traditional. How they move from one place to another, where they summer, where they winter. I've even had radioed ones that each winter would go to the same bed sites on the cliffs. The introduced populations, they aren't tied to anything. They've been dumped into a place where they've never seen before, so they're much more likely to colonize new areas and spread themselves out across the landscape. And that's happening in the Beartooth. Somebody else back there.
It just seems so like, why would they stay there with all those people and cars and the ranger being to keep people from getting them? I mean, why do they stay there? People are solid.
Yeah, and why did the goats stay at Logan Pass with all those darn people there? Yeah, and it's really ironic. Your question is, and it's a good one, after I talked about how sensitive goats are to people and everything. But think of it like the bears in Yellowstone. You know, the way it used to be with the garbage dumps and, you know, the campgrounds where they could get food at will and so forth. Those bears had really lost fear. Black bears and grizzly had really lost their fear of humans. And it's all a matter of conditioning. They got no negative reinforcement for associating with people. They only got positive reinforcements. And so if nothing bad happens to you when you grab a backpack or the person that's wearing it, or you go into a dumpster or whatever and you get a food reward, why not do it again until you get some negative reinforcement? Goats are like that around Logan Pass, for one thing, because they've never really had bad experiences with humans, at least not really bad ones. People may yell at them, throw snowballs at them, and that's about as bad as it gets. But they get positive reinforcement, and you know why? Because they get a nutrient reward from people. Salt. Licking backpacks, and more importantly, licking little puddles of urine that people leave behind. As soon as you get away from the visitor center, there's no outhouses. And the goats, like on the Hidden Lake Overlook and on the Highline Trail, have gotten so they actually follow people. And they're waiting for you to take a leak. They are so addicted to salt in the early part of the summer, late spring, early summer. Same thing over in Olympic National Park. There's a university professor, Dr. Joel Berger, in the biology department, who has a student studying the very thing you're talking about now, trying to find out what's going on with these goats that have lost their fear of people and are associating with people so much. And it'll be interesting to see what comes out of that. Somebody else had a question. Yes, I'm sorry.
I know that mountain goats are herbivores, but do you know if they've ever been observed eating army cutworm moths? They're kind of in that.
Yeah, they'd be in that area, wouldn't they? No, I don't. No. When I was a graduate student here, there was a professor by the name of P.L. Wright, who was the mammologist and the ornithologist. And I wanted more than anything to be a teaching assistant for Dr. P.L. Wright. He'd come here in 1939 from Vermont. And he has the museum over there, the Specimen Museum, named after him. And when I was teaching a class one day, as a very early 20-something, people my age I was teaching, and that was really quite intimidating. A friend of mine who was another graduate student would always sit right in front of me and look at me. And that particular day we had gotten to rodents, and I was discussing the biology and ecology of the hoary marmot. And I made the point that of all the mammals that you can think of, there's no species other than the hoary marmot that is as sympatric, has as closely an overlap in its range with the mountain goat. And he raised his hand and he says, well, you know why, don't you? With this grin on his face. And I said, why? And he says, because goats eat marmots. Which of course is not true. Do they eat, these moths? I don't know. or the larvae. I don't really know that. I'd be surprised. I've never, incidentally, they'll pick up insects and stuff, but I'm not aware that they eat any kind of animal matter. Well, thanks, everybody. Oh, one last one.
I'd like to have you repeat the concept that if this species is an indicator species, as some people take for elk, if you keep this population healthy, you keep the pika, the marmot, the birds, and everything else that are part of the entire system healthy. Do you believe that concept? If you keep one attractive, romantic, photographic critter in healthy numbers, that everything else is kept healthy too?
I do. The umbrella species concept. And I try to make that point in the epilogue that the mountain goat does this double duty. It can renew us spiritually, but then it serves as a protector for a whole community of species that shares its range. It's harder to do that with some species. There's a fritillary butterfly that lives where mountain goats do, but try and use that to save ecosystems, and it's pretty hard. But we certainly ought to be able to do it with this animal as an example of what shouldn't be lost. So I agree with you completely. Yeah, thank you. I have books up here just so nobody's shocked. The book sells for $35. I'd be glad to sign it for you. I had intended to bring a lot, but I sold all but 5 of the books that I had in Hamilton on Saturday. We had over 200 people, so first come, first serve. And I have a couple of other books that I wrote too about elk and so forth. Thanks, everybody.